U.S. government funded a British disinformation nonprofit. It blacklists conservative media and directs ad revenue to liberal media. Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. You know, the U.S. government talks a lot about countering disinformation and promoting democracy all over the world. There's lots of ways it goes about it, but one way is through money. Because as far as the government is concerned, the answer to any problem is to throw money at it. But hey, it's not their money, it's your money, which is now their money. But while the money comes from the U.S. government, where it ends up is another story. Which is how you end up with today's topic, the U.S. State Department bankrolling the censorship of American conservative media, which should be scary even if you're not conservative. How did this happen? It all begins at the State Department. The State Department funds its own organizations, such as the Global Engagement Center. It also spends money on private affiliates, such as the National Endowment for Democracy. Those two organizations gave a total of $665,000 to a British nonprofit organization called the Global Disinformation Index, or GDI. Although technically that money went through GDI's affiliate, a US-based nonprofit called the AN Foundation, also known as the Disinformation Index Foundation. So what is GDI, and why was the US government funding it? The Global Disinformation Index was created in 2018 by Claire Melford, a former senior vice president for MTV Networks, and Daniel Rogers, an adjunct professor at New York University. The goal was to counter disinformation, and without having to deal with free speech protections. How does GDI do that? By encouraging demonetization, the exact thing YouTube loves using on this channel, and my other one, China Uncensored. Here's how it works. GDI gives a disinformation risk rating to news sites across the internet. It then makes that information available to advertising companies. It's technically up to those companies to decide whether to stop putting ads on those risky news sites. But advertising companies basically rely on the information from GDI to redirect ad money to safe news sites with a low disinformation risk rating and keep ads off dangerous disinformation spreading news sites with a high risk rating. GDI even makes a dynamic exclusion list of the highest risk sites. It's quite a time saver for the ad companies. That way they don't have to decide who to demonetize. GDI does it for them. According to GDI, demonetization presents a pathway that protects free speech and choice while addressing the perverse incentives that drive the corruption of our information environment. You know, at first that can sound pretty good.
However, reducing the financial incentive to create harmful content is a much more market-friendly, democracy-protecting way of nudging the information ecosystem towards a much healthier place.
See, it's so market-friendly and democracy-protecting. The problem is this. How does GDI determine what's disinformation and harmful content? Well, GDI claims it uses cutting-edge AI combined with thorough analysis of journalistic practice to inform advertisers which websites to avoid. It also claims to look at 80 different signals, including 18 different indicators such as article bias, negative targeting, sourcing, policy guidelines, and more. I'll go more into that later. Now, needless to say, the way GDI goes about ranking news sites is causing a bit of controversy. GDI claims to be neutral, but the Washington Examiner, a conservative news site, begs to differ. It says the GDI has created a blacklist targeting conservative media, and it might have some reason for thinking that. Out of 69 U.S. news sites, GDI ranked the top 10 news sites with the highest level of disinformation risk. All of them were conservative and libertarian news sites, such as the New York Post, Reason Magazine, and the Daily Wire. Meanwhile, all of the 10 lowest risk news sites are left-leaning. These include the likes of the New York Times, BuzzFeed News, and even the Huffington Post. How did GDI come up with these rankings? I'll explain after the break. Welcome back. The Global Disinformation Index wants to demonetize disinformation. It ended up creating a blacklist of conservative news media sites, thanks in part to funding from the U.S. government. That blacklist is GDI's dynamic exclusion list. And according to the CEO, this has had a significant impact on the advertising revenue that has gone to those sites. So essentially, bleeding conservative news sites dry of cash. Now, most people wouldn't even know about GDI if the Washington Examiner hadn't reported on it. But now it's in the spotlight and its rankings are under scrutiny. So how does GDI define and rank disinformation risk? GDI says it wants to go beyond fact-checking and content moderation. It's not just looking for whether something's true or not, because determining what's true is extremely difficult to assess at scale. GDI goes so far as to say not all false statements are disinformation. Meanwhile, a technically true statement can be presented out of context in a misleading and harmful way. What do they mean, not all false statements are disinformation? Well, the example GDI gives is how NORAD claims to track Santa Claus around the world on Christmas Eve. While it's clearly false, it doesn't do any harm. Unlike Santa, who's harming the environment by giving out coal to bad kids. Clearly, Santa should be giving those kids wind turbines. So what's an example of a true statement that's misleading and harmful, according to GDI? Breitbart has an entire section called Illegal Alien, which shows headlines mostly related to crimes committed by illegal immigrants. While those stories might technically be true, the way they're presented could lead people to believe that illegal immigrants disproportionately commit more crimes. Okay, so they've got a point there. But how GDI decided to solve this disinformation problem is pretty alarming. GDI's solution is to view disinformation through the lens of adversarial narrative conflict.
So the way GDI thinks about disinformation is through the lens of what we call adversarial narratives. So disinformation is not an event, it's a process that happens over time. And it happens through repeated exposure to content that is setting you, the reader, against the subject of that content.
See, it's all about how you define disinformation and who gets to define it. GDI defines disinformation as adversarial narratives that are intentionally misleading, financially or ideologically motivated, foster long-term conflict, and create a risk of harm by undermining trust in science or targeting at-risk individuals or institutions. Ideologically motivated? Fostering social, political, or economic conflict? That's literally every op-ed and commentary you see online. But what's really concerning is that last part about undermining trust. GDI is labeling content disinformation if it causes harm against people according to their status as at-risk individuals, or whether content sows distrust in institutions. What institutions are we talking about? The media? The police? The government? The science? It almost sounds like GDI is targeting anti-establishment media. But isn't the media supposed to be anti-establishment? Aren't they supposed to hold powerful people and institutions accountable? Because the opposite of that is media that backs up powerful people and institutions. You know, like state-run media, which never sows disinformation. The problem is, GDI gets to decide how to define disinformation, who is at risk, and whether distrust against institutions is okay. And it isn't just news that's being scrutinized. Not even opinion pieces are safe. How does GDI determine what's disinformation and what's legitimate criticism and distrust? Don't worry about it. They have a foolproof system. In order to get the data for its ranking, GDI says that analysts went through anonymized articles without knowing the publisher or author. They say they trained their analysts to use a highly structured methodology where they answer 17 questions based on the content pillars from earlier. Who designed the questions? What samples were used to design the questions in the first place? Was there any bias in the way the analysts were trained? How dare you ask? Questions like that just foster conflict and distrust in institutions. Definitely disinformation. Anyway, GDI's focus on narratives gives a lot of wiggle room for left-leaning news media, even if they show bias and present information that's factually false. For example, NPR is considered a minimum risk site that had neutral, fact-based content with just a small degree of bias and sensationalism. This is despite the fact that NPR dismissed the New York Post's Hunter Biden laptop story, even though it ended up being true. Or the time they peddled left-leaning frameworks for interpreting the Declaration of Independence. And when they called Boston's first female Asian American mayor a disappointment since 3 black candidates didn't win. But NPR doesn't sound biased or sensational, so it must be good. And anyway, factual accuracy is difficult to assess at scale, so it isn't part of GDI's system for determining disinformation. Makes total sense. NPR isn't the only left-leaning news site that made the grade. Other left-leaning media sites have also, at times, shared false information and framed things in a very biased way. But they still got a pass. Meanwhile, libertarian Reason magazine was labeled as high risk, but not because of facts or even bias or sensationalism. Oh no, it was because it doesn't police its own comments section, and for other reasons that aren't well explained. Now, I'm not trying to argue that left-leaning media are worse than right-leaning ones. The problem is that GDI, a foreign entity funded in part by the US government, is penalizing one side of the US political spectrum through demonetization. According to the Washington Examiner, a member of GDI's advisory panel said this could definitely appear to be cloaked censorship. Even if the State Department and its affiliates weren't aware of this, there are already serious concerns about whether the US government is violating the First Amendment right to free speech by proxy. Even Microsoft, which was subscribed to GDI services, is trying to keep its distance. Probably a good call since Republicans, who now have control over the House Judiciary Committee, are vowing to investigate the State Department's involvement with GDI. Republican senators are also vowing to investigate. And when they do, I'm willing to bet that they'll present an adversarial narrative conflict. Meanwhile, the National Endowment for Democracy has cut ties with GDI. That's one of the organizations I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that gave hundreds of thousands of US taxpayer dollars to GDI. The NED says the money they gave GDI was earmarked for countering disinformation from authoritarian regimes around the world. But since they became aware that GDI is also working on US media disinformation, they were not going to fund the group again. Of course, if the Washington Examiner hadn't engaged in this adversarial narrative investigative reporting, the NED would probably still be giving them money. So what do you think of the Global Disinformation Index? Leave your comments below. And if you like this show, remember that we rely mainly on direct support from viewers like you. All it takes is as little as $1 per episode over on our crowdfunding website, Patreon. Visit patreon.com/AmericaUncovered for more. Click the link below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.